Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's panel discussion in response to the film The Boys Who Said No. This is hosted by New Hampshire Peace Action. And if you are not familiar with us, you can check us out at www.nhpeaceaction.org. If you are new to our organization, we educate, mobilize, and organize to build a more peaceful and just future for all. We envisage a future where international relations are based on cooperation instead of competition and conflict, and where mutual benefit and shared security lead to a more peaceful and just global community. Before we jump in, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that the land where we live and work was not uninhabited when European settlers arrived here with their ideas of conquest and ownership. For most of us, we live on the ancestral homelands of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples, past and present. We honor with gratitude the land and waterways that they've been stewarding throughout the generations. We pause and remember that we live on ground that is sacred, ground that was stolen, ground that cries out for justice and responsible stewardship. May our remembering help us find the courage to do our part to restore wholeness to the earth and all of her people. So as we get started, I'm pretty excited for tonight. I hope everybody has had a chance to watch the film. And we've invited Michael Ferber, who is one of New Hampshire's great peace treasures. He was one of the 5 people covered in the movie who were tried for returning draft registrations to the Department of Justice. He was interviewed a few times in the film, in the middle to end of it. But also Michael has been a really important part of New Hampshire Peace Action's trajectory. He's been on and off the board since the beginning. He's been co-chair of the board for a significant part of the last 12 years when I've been director. His counsel has been invaluable, and his presence has been such a positive influence on us. And I deeply appreciate that Michael was willing to talk about this film that he was part of. I'm excited to hear what he has to say. And we're also joined tonight by Emma Shapiro-Weiss, who is one of the co-directors of 350 New Hampshire. So 350 New Hampshire does all of its own fundraising and chooses their own course as far as trajectory goes, but they are part of New Hampshire Peace Action Education Fund's corporate structure, meaning we are their employees are on our payroll and their books run through our office. We take in their gifts. And so 350 New Hampshire has been a part of New Hampshire Peace Action for a few years. And I think, Emma, you've been with 350 New Hampshire for 4 years now, 3 years?
Less, almost 3 years.
Almost 3 years.
Yep.
Well, in that time, you've made a big impact, and we're deeply appreciative that you're here. And Emma's role on the panel tonight is going to be to talk a little bit about some of the civil disobedience and nonviolent action that is being done to protect our planet in New Hampshire right now. And I'll let Emma get into that when her time comes. As we open, Michael, I'm hoping you can kick us off by giving us kind of 10 minutes of your thoughts and responses to the film. As you know, I know you were part of making the film, but you've only recently had a chance to see it because it hasn't been out long. How are you feeling about it? And talk to us about the film.
Great, thank you, Will, and thanks for your kind remarks. My only part in making the film was to show up for a long interview and to contribute a little bit of money toward it. It did take a long time in the making because it's very expensive to make a movie like that, you can imagine. And they kept, nobody was rich behind it. The only person who had any real money to give was Joan Baez, and she mainly just donated all her songs. I mean, she didn't demand any rights and so on. So that helped a lot. So that took time. So I had little part in it except to be interviewed. But you may have noticed that the film, though I think it's an excellent film, is very heavily oriented toward the Bay Area and toward David Harris and Joni. And that was the original idea behind it. It was maybe 6 years ago that they had a reunion of the Bay Area draft resistors in Christopher Colorado's house in the Castro area of San Francisco. And they thought we should just tell the story. And so David and Joni would certainly be at the center of it because he was the leading spokesman for it in the West Coast. But about halfway through the making of it, it dawned on some of them that they should branch out and see what happened in the rest of the country. I remember at the time, there were 4 organizers in the Bay Area to spread the idea of turning in draft cards as opposed to burning them. And they called themselves the Resistance. That was the spring of 1967. And the 4 of them decided to divvy up organizing. So I think Harris took the Bay Area. Another guy took Southern California. Another guy took Northern California, far north, and Oregon and Washington. And the 4th guy, Lenny Heller, took the rest of the United States. He actually was as good as his word. He got to Boston where I met him and he stirred up a lot of interest and so on. They did, in making the movie, they did get in touch with Michael Foley, who's written a very good book about the New England resistance. And Foley said, look, you can't leave out the New England resistance. And in particular, you should get in touch with Ferber. Well, Foley and I are good friends. He was a graduate student at the University of New Hampshire in the history department, wanting to write about the draft resistance movement in the Boston area. So the history department said, well, you should go over to the English department and talk to Ferber. He was part of this. So he interviewed me at length. We spent a lot of time together. He found all my old friends. We had a reunion, etc. So Michael became our best historian of the whole country, really. And I'm glad so he was the sort of talking head throughout as the historian. But I think the movie, so they tried to correct the imbalance, but I think it remains a little bit too Bay Area centered. Bay Area would be important in any fair movie about it. Like there's nothing about New York City, which had, except the burning in Central Park early on. The Philadelphia resistance was really good. Rick Boardman and the Chicago group, they were important. They didn't try too hard except to get me in and a few other little bits. So it creates a somewhat misleading impression, but it's good. I also thought the movie should have said a little bit more about strategy. Instead, and it's quite understandable, they concentrated on the individual guys and why they turned in their draft cards or why they went to prison or whatever they did. It varied from boy to boy, and that's fine. And of course, nobody who turned in his draft card did so on the spur of the moment or did so out of cold-blooded strategic reasons. You had to be really committed and ready to face a couple of years in prison. Still, there was a strategy. And particularly in the East Coast, I think we were a little bit more strategy oriented. We did a little research and we found that at that time, there were only about 5,000 federal cases a year. Most laws are state laws. If you murder somebody or whatever, that's a state matter. The feds rarely get involved. And the federal prison system was not that large. So it seemed quite possible if we got a few thousand cases for refusing to carry draft cards or refusing induction, we could start seriously clogging the courts and clogging the prisons. And as the war became increasingly controversial, we thought this would have to go to Congress to create more courts or more prisons or whatever. It would be an additional sore point for the government to manage this. So we didn't totally clog the courts. The movie talks about some of the cities where judges were just dismissing all cases in the end. And in those cities, the draft essentially no longer existed. If you were willing to go to the hassle of being indicted and going to court, et cetera, you could just avoid the draft that way. But that was late after a couple of years of this. But at least the idea was that we could actually fill the jails, to use Martin Luther King's slogan. Now, filling the Chattanooga or whatever county jail for a weekend for a bunch of sit-ins is different from filling the federal prison system for 2 years. But it was the same idea. and it was not beyond possibility. By the end, I think we were clogging some courts at some points, and we were making the prisons a bit uncomfortable for the prison managements. But I think so, though I think that story should have been told a little more. In the end, it did come down to one guy after another just deciding in his own conscience, after talking it over with his family or his girlfriend or whatever, am I going to do it? And they did it. And I think the movie captured that, I think, quite well. One or two other little things, and I'm glad to pass this on. In Oakland, that stopped the draft week, it was made quite clear, David Harris was talking about this, that the first day was nonviolent. But from then on, a different group had taken over the streets of Oakland. And they were really something close to riots, with people running from the cops and throwing things back at the cops and breaking windows and so on and so forth. Harris thought that was a mess and that it set it back. There was also a lovely discussion between him and Mark Rudd, who had been in the Weather Underground. They were blowing up buildings. Rudd has since repented of all that and congratulated Harris for having the right idea at the time. It was a difficult time for us. The reason I joined Draft Resistance, one of the reasons was that I was running out of options. I couldn't think of what to do. I'd been on every march, and the marches were getting longer. I had written to all my Congress people. I even lobbied my congressman directly because he was a friend of my family's, and I actually saw him sitting on the front porch of our next door neighbor, who was also a friend, and I lobbied him directly about the war. He was a liberal Democrat, but he could do nothing, he felt, because Lyndon Johnson, the liberal Democrat, had him. He couldn't move. Johnson would kill him. And I thought, well, we can't get a liberal Democrat to oppose the war. What are we going to do? So there's that. And I thought, well, maybe this strange strategy or idea coming out of the West Coast would be something we could do. It would be nonviolent. It would be democratic in a way because we're all doing it by our own volition. We're taking the consequences of it. We're not fleeing and so on. But we were kind of desperate for tactics. And other groups feeling equally desperate, since people are being killed by the thousands every day in Vietnam, equally desperate people were deciding to go underground and blow up things with the risk of killing people. So it's a hard thing for the peace movement to stay peaceful when you're feeling desperate. And I think it's a hard thing for the environmental movement. There's some books out now. There's one out called How to Blow Up a Pipeline. You probably know this, Emma, by I think he's a German writer. And he gives a very eloquent case for why we should start blowing up things. There's a reply to it, of course, but I think a fair and it's an agonizing debate. And we were going through a version of that then. My group and the other groups I was with stayed nonviolent, and I think we were right. I think we reached more people that way and so on. Blowing up buildings could very well have played into the hands of Nixon, for instance, because he could say we're just a bunch of terrorists and don't care about human life ourselves. Still, I still feel some sympathy for those who went that way. Some of them were friends of mine and were underground for years or did long prison sentences when they were finally caught. But anyway, that's an issue we always have to think about. When the movement gets big and when we feel desperately urgent, as we must about global warming, how do we keep our cool? How do we stay steady? How do we stay effective without turning to violence? It's not easy. And I'll just add a little personal note at the end. My own case was different from everybody else's in the movie. I expected to be drafted, and indeed I was drafted. But the same day I got my draft notice, I got a notice from federal court in Boston that I'd been indicted for conspiracy. Those are the two things in my mailbox that day. And I found out that you cannot be drafted into the US Army if you have a federal felony case pending. So remember that. So I wrote to my draft board and said, I'm sorry, Federal court beat you to it. But if I'm finally acquitted, I'll come to Buffalo, my hometown, and I'll refuse induction. So I stood trial for conspiracy with several famous people, Dr. Spock, the baby doctor, of course, and William Sloane Coffin, who was the chaplain at Yale University and a very well-known man, and two other older guys. I was the only draft resistor in that group because the government was going after those who were supporting them with statements. They were receiving draft cards. They were saying things like, I'm equally guilty. I have aided and abetted the receipt of draft cards, etc. I hadn't done that, except I brought a bag of 200 and something draft cards to Washington, which included my own draft card, and turned it over to the delegation that were going into the Justice Department building. So I expected to be indicted all by myself just for draft refusal or for turning in my own draft card. It was quite a surprise and frankly rather fun to be indicted for conspiracy with these famous people and to have a whole lot of press attention. So I'm lucky in a way that I had all that attention and fame for a while, and the punishment would have been no worse than if I had refused induction. So I was singled out in a way that none of the other guys had the luck to be. They had to go by themselves, alone, or with a group of friends, into trial, and then go off to prison. I was then drafted a year and a half later, after I was finally acquitted of the conspiracy case for very complicated technical reasons not worth going into. And I wrote a letter. I was then in Europe for vacation, and I wrote a letter saying, well, I'm in Europe. When I come back, I'll come to Buffalo and refuse induction. And they just dropped it. To this day, I do not know why I was not actually forced to show up a second time. I was nearly 36 then, 26, which was the usual cutoff date. I expected to go to prison, but I think they may have decided that, I don't know, I was either too well known in Buffalo, or they just didn't want to be hassled with it. I don't know what it was, but they just dropped it. So through a series of flukes and some good luck, I never actually went to prison. But a lot of my good friends did, and most of them still feel, as you could tell from the movie, that they were glad they did and had some effect. I had some effect too, but not because I actually had to pay the full price. I still feel a little guilty that I didn't have to go to prison, but what can you do? Bob Eaton, one of the ones who did go to prison, said in the film that Sanctuary was not successful. And I thought that was a little mysterious because it wasn't explained. There wasn't explained what he meant by it. In the Arlington Street Church, the same place we turned in draft cards in the fall of '67, in the spring of '68, just when our trial began, the Arlington Street Church offered sanctuary to two guys. One was an AWOL soldier and one was a draft resistor who had refused induction. That is to say, they allowed the two men to stay in the church, to live there in effect, until the police came to arrest them. And they'd even stay in the sanctuary if necessary, with friends. So indeed, the police came to arrest them and they had to step over the bodies of a couple hundred people. People sat in front of the police cars. It was big, quite a ruckus, all nonviolent, but quite serious. The same day our trial began, that happened just a couple of miles away. And then churches all over the country, mostly Protestant, but a few others, decided to do this, to offer sanctuary. I think it was actually very effective. I think Bob Eaton was mistaken. It was terrible press for the government. Here are these churches saying, this draft resistor, we support him, we respect his conscience. We're not going to try to physically keep the police from coming in, but he is welcome to stay here until he's arrested. And there must have been, 50 to 75 of these around the country. Bob said, well, we gave up on churches and we just did it in a coffee house. That wasn't as effective. Sanctuary is a religious concept, not a legal one. So that's just a footnote. So let me pass it on now to back to Will or to Emma.
Yeah, let me just say a word about why we wanted Emma to speak to this film. And we're in a moment where there's not a lot of, and for a while, there hasn't been a lot of nonviolent direct action in the classic sense used to oppose war. And that's, I mean, I'm generalizing there. There's been quite a bit. I've twice been arrested, but what I consider what I was doing in both cases to be more nonviolent direct theatrics, doing something that I knew would get me arrested, but probably wouldn't give me a long jail cell. But as we consider, 350 as part of New Hampshire peace action, and the reason for that is complicated and thorough in that, number one, the U.S. military is the largest user of fossil fuels on Earth. Number two, we went to war in Iraq and Afghanistan. The Caspian pipeline was slotted to move across that country before we attacked, and the Taliban was blocking that. And Saddam Hussein was no longer playing nice with American oil companies in exporting his oil. We seem to have a great interest in exporting freedom and democracy to places where there is a lot of oil or natural gas. And by that, I mean that military Keynesianism, which is, as we've seen an erosion of most industry in the US, military Keynesianism is our manufacturing base now. And the environmental movement, both as it is an attempt to stop the violence that will inevitably happen as access to drinking water erodes due to global warming, as agriculture collapses due to global warming, and also as militarism is linked to climate change and fossil fuel use. We wanted a perspective from somebody who has done real civil disobedience with very real risks in our contemporary struggle, and that's Emma. So Emma, can you jump in and talk about your response to the film, and also talk a little bit about the civil disobedience that you've been engaged in?
Yeah, totally. Thank you, Will. So I love this movie, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak, because so much of this movie felt familiar to me. Like, we use a lot of the same language in the movements that I'm a part of. We use some similar tactics. We use song and singing in a very similar way. And that was really powerful to me and felt so beautiful. And it was really meaningful because resistance like that spans beyond those years and beyond those moments. It's really so powerful that resistance inspires over generations, over decades. And I grew up hearing about protesting the Vietnam War and the draft and the civil rights movement. And my parents both separately were going to protests in New York, protesting the Vietnam War. My mom would take the train from Mount Vernon to the city and go with her friends. We're with thousands of other people protesting and getting tear gassed. And my dad would also go to Times Square during rush hour with thousands of people and, lay down in Times Square all over the streets to get visibility, to, make the news, to highlight what was happening in Vietnam. And tactical police would come in buses and with horses and billy clubs and beat people up. And he always says that he had really, really long hair. So he had described many instances to me when I was growing up of the police ripping out his hair. And then before that, he was in high school in Exeter, in New Hampshire, and he described to me seniors at his school, burning their draft cards. So this movement inspired my parents to take action and get involved. And that experience laid a foundation for me to fight for people and to fight for what's right. And that feels like a really beautiful generational journey to me, and a connection to my parents, that as they were young, they were doing that. And now I find myself blocking coal trains from time to time and doing direct action to create a movement. So it felt so connected to what I'm doing now, because like they were describing in the movie, it really comes down to a moral decision to not be a part of the system, to resist the system that is killing people and demanding that we have a part in killing people as well for profit. And of course, this emphasis from the movie of building a movement, which is at the core of my organization and our campaign, the No Coal, No Gas campaign, who I've done a lot of almost all my direct action with. So to just go a little bit into this campaign, it's a regional campaign to shut down Merrimack Station, the last coal plant in the Northeast. And this plant sits right along the Merrimack River in Bow, New Hampshire, and 600,000 people depend on the Merrimack River for drinking water, and hundreds of thousands more are expected to use it in the future. And its flowing rivers have river herring and other migratory fish in it. And in its watershed, there are bald eagles and tons of other species. And it's a beautiful flowing river. And in the town of Bow, there's only one public access point for this river where families can come and enjoy it. And it's right on this coal plant's property. So we started this campaign in 2019. There was definitely a foundation before then, but we started in the way we are now in 2019 and did the largest climate direct action in New Hampshire since the 70s, where 69 people were arrested. And our goal then was really to create a regional resistance that can not only shut down this plant, but that can create a movement of climate dissonance. And after that action, we stopped a number of coal trains that were heading to Merrimack Station to resupply coal to Merrimack Station when they definitely didn't need any more coal. And a number of amazing smaller actions have happened in the years since then. We also did a utility strike because almost everyone in New England is currently paying 10 to 20% of their electricity bill in subsidies to these old polluting fossil fuel fired power plants. So folks ceased payment of their utility bills and redirected payments to BIPOC-led organizations. So I can definitely go into particular actions if anyone's interested, but this is kind of a snapshot of the movement that we're trying to create in New England.
All right, folks, let's open it up for questions. And I had a good question to kick off, but it was about your reactions to the conversation between Paul Rudd and David Harris.
Yeah.
And Michael responded to that quite a bit. So Emma, have you struggled with that in your work with folks who are to go back to the example that was used later, who are advocating for blowing up pipelines and that kind of thing?
Unmute. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we have struggled with that, especially the instance I can think of recently is a reporter recently was trying to kind of encourage us to say that we believed in that in kind of like a gotcha moment. And that's not what we advocate for in our group. Like we have a definition of nonviolence that we all kind of base our actions off of. And I can definitely understand like anger and frustration and the moment that we're all feeling. I think climate activists definitely live with that every single day. But yeah, that is a struggle, and deep conversations have definitely been had with people that are feeling that.
Maybe I could add a thought here. In the movie, there's a few minutes given to what we call the ultra resistance, which was started with a group of Catholic priests who were breaking into draft boards, taking the files out and napalming them, or pouring blood on them, or in some way destroying them. And that happened in quite a few cases all around the country. Now, that, to my way of thinking, was not violent, but it seemed a step farther from turning in your own draft card and refusing induction. It was breaking and destroying public property, federal property, et cetera. And it seems to me that that's an analogy toward, that the environmental movement might consider. Are there things we can do to break in someplace and cause a mess among the people who are messing the environment? I'm not naming anything in particular, but I mean, it's a way to think about it. In other words, a kind of sabotage where you would stand around and get arrested and pay the price. I mean, I think we need to be looking for possible analogies there.
Thank you both. Some food for thought there. David, you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Okay.
Sure, but actually there was a hand up before mine. Yeah, Bill was before me. I followed his lead. So maybe take Bill, Will, and then I'll go after him.
Okay, thank you, David. Yeah, I kind of put it down early. Well, I think this question about tactics is really interesting. And I think it's important to kind of see things along a continuum. Obviously, killing cops and bombing buildings is kind of like, a far end of things that no one really can endorse. But I really like the idea of this kind of incremental stuff. There was a group when I was doing anti-uranium organizing back in the 70s and 80s called General Assembly to Stop the Power Line. And they unleashed these things called bolt weevils. And the bolt weevils would go up to power lines and they'd unscrew the bolts right before a windstorm. And amazingly, these towers would topple over. That's kind of like, eco-terrorism, I suppose. But I kind of like the idea of these incremental steps. There's a great story of this guy, Shell Trapp, told about going into the banks in Chicago when they were redlining and wouldn't open up accounts for poor people, that everybody went in with bags of coins and overwhelmed the bank with so many bags of coins. And often they would drop the coins on the floor of the bank, and they just kind of shut down the banking system in Chicago until they would recognize that poor people needed accounts. So I just want to kind of, throw that out there, that there's the idea of having these kind of incremental steps and being able to annoy the powers to be, I think are effective, and particularly if they're done in a strategy of repeating them and being able to really see it as building towards something bigger and more important. Isolated stuff doesn't work, obviously, but I think the idea of having a kind of continuum of resistance actions is a cool concept.
David? Thank you.
Yeah, I have a sort of tactical question and then a really large bore question. The tactical one is probably mostly for you, Emma. There's a moment in the movie, actually an hour and 5 minutes in there, where somebody says that, he went to trial and represented himself pro se and threw himself on the mercy of the court, not trying to avoid punishment, except possibly through jury nullification, and basically never lawyered up at all. And no coal, no gas has seemed to bring lawyers, very effective lawyers or very competent lawyers in the trial room. So I wonder what the debates are there on whether to represent oneself pro se or to go for a lawyer. The more conceptual question is, what is conscience? There's some sort of a case in New Hampshire that people have told me about, where a guy used the necessity defense. He was unhoused and he broke into the vestibule of an apartment building, committing trespass and breaking and entering and so on. And his lawyer said, well, this guy didn't want to do that. This guy didn't think that was right. He violated his own conscience. It was the middle of winter, because otherwise he would have frozen to death. So the comparative harms, or the necessity defense, actually was directly opposed to his conscience, right? And so I'm wondering, to what extent conscience lines up with necessity, or is actually the opposite? And, of course, right-wingers use conscience kinds of arguments all the time to say, they're going to bomb an abortion clinic or something like that. So just kind of how do we think about conscience in this conceptual way?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I can go for your first question comment, and that is that in our campaign, a number of people have gone pro se and are encouraged to. I think that can be really powerful thing to do, not only learning how to navigate the legal system yourself, but we also try to do as best we can to support people going through the legal system. Don't really believe that once the action happens, that it's over and done with forever. There's this whole secondary piece that can be much scarier because the legal system inherently isolates people and is really jargony, and half of what is said in a legal space, regular folks don't understand. I know I don't understand it half the time until folks on our team help explain to me what they mean. So yeah, creating support systems to help people understand legal jargon and to not feel isolated in the legal system is huge in our movement. But also, yeah, definitely encouraging people to go pro se if they feel comfortable with it. And it can also, it creates gaps in the legal system that you can see. Like a lot of the time when people go pro se in our movement, prosecutors won't send them the same things they send our lawyers, or they won't be included in the same way. And that's because of like the way the legal system looks at folks that are going pro se.
Michael, did you want to respond to that too?
Yes, but I think the definition of conscience is rather too large a subject to take up tonight, David. I'm sorry. I think we need a separate session on it. But Arnie posted a question that may bear on a slice of that, which is, did the conscientious objectors back in the 60s and 70s, were they in any kind of tension with the draft resistors? And I think the answer was sometimes yes, but not normally. I mean, I was very glad to see conscientious objectors, which is a perfectly legal category. I tried for it myself before I became a resistor. I failed to get it because I was a Unitarian, not a Quaker. My draft board looked at a little short list of peace churches and the Unitarians weren't on it, so I didn't get it. But by the end of that summer when I tried, I was so fed up with even the process of trying to get it and so agonized over the war that I decided I didn't even want to be a CO. And our argument in general was that being a CO, a conscientious objector, was a kind of channel to channel off the troublemakers, the Quakers, the Mennonites, various other people. There was a pamphlet published by the Selective Service System called Manpower Channeling, which was not discussed in the movie, in which they frankly said that the real reason for a draft in America is not to get men to join the army. It's to get them to do everything else to avoid joining the army. They were remarkably candid. This was published, passed out in press kits and so on. They said this is the American or indirect way of doing what some countries do by command, like Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. In other words, they were well aware that most men didn't want to go in the army. So how do you get out of it? Well, you can get an exemption or a deferment by doing something we want you to do. Does the high school system need chemistry teachers? Well, then we'll allow exemptions if you go study chemistry in college and teach it in the high school. And this is manpower channeling. Well, when this was published, they were very embarrassed. They withdrew it from circulation, et cetera, because it was caused a huge stink. But our thought was that conscientious objection was a little tiny channel, sort of a little escape, like at the top of a pressure cooker, to get the really troublesome types, the pacifists, out of the hair of the system. Whereas what we were doing was not really a channel, or if it was an extremely narrow one, going to prison, clogging the courts, and so on. So I think that's what that was about. So a lot of COs, I think, felt, well, I've done a lot just getting my CO. I'm going to work 2 years in a hospital, which is perfectly honorable, and that was all true. But some of us felt, well, even that maybe was not quite enough. It was very hard to say. I think there was both sides welcomed the other for the most part, but there was some tension.
Thank you, Michael. So I'm going to come back to Chris, and I'm going to go to Mary's question next. And first off, hey Mary, it's great to see you. It's been a few years, and I'm going to skip to Mary here because I'm curious if Unitarianism is my understanding was that Unitarian Universalism is a peace church at this point. Is that do you know if I'm right or wrong about that, Mary? Oh, Mary disappeared just as I spoke her name.
Mary's at UCC, which is not Unitarian.
Oh, I thought you were a UU minister, Mary.
UCC is Unitarians Considering Christ, but that's a whole nother matter. No, I have to say it is a joy to be with you today. I feel like an interloper. I'm speaking to you from Sacramento, California, where it's 105 degrees today.
Right.
But seeing your faces and knowing the work you all are doing is definitely balm for my soul. I also have known Michael for over 30 years. And first just want to say, though Michael has been talking about this film for several years now, and I knew it was in the making, I didn't see it till last night. I'm probably still going to get emotional because I think that part of our history has been so subverted and altered. My brother was a CO in the Vietnam War. In 5th grade, I wore a black armband the day of the moratorium, and my 5th grade, the principal of my school told me to take it off, and I told him to call my mother. But it wasn't until I moved to New Hampshire and met Michael that I realized that the heroes that my mother used to worship, Benjamin Spock, William Sloane Coffin, Michael Ferber, were actually real people. And it's been a joy to know Michael and to know of his commitment, and therefore learn some of these stories. I think hearing the conversation, so first I want to say the film was amazing, and I think it raised so many issues that are so relevant right now as we look at so many critical issues and sort of the lack of muscle for resistance that we've created over the last few decades, except in some pockets of folks. And here in California, certainly there are some robust movements. I think that actually Ferguson in 2014 may have been an opportunity for a lot of communities to reinvest in what it means to be part of a resistance. And I think here we struggle because I work within the faith community. I am unapologetically coming from a particular set of ethics and values that for me are an outgrowth of my spiritual convictions. And so I very much am committed to peace and nonviolence. And I find that one of the challenges right now, and I'd love to hear folks reflect on this, working a lot also with BLM, and having some of my partners that are working within the Black community say, so there's a book that came out a couple of years ago that we did a book study of called In Defense of Looting. And it talked about the ways in which our whole society has been based on the looting of human beings, the looting of land, the looting, and that for those who are oppressed, for those who have been decentered, to use forms of looting of material things, not human bodies, is a much lesser violence, a lesser evil, and calls attention to, it stirs things up in a way that sort of the circling the Capitol and singing and getting arrested for that certainly is a way to resist certain things. But I've been really challenged to think about how far are any of us called to go to acknowledge that sometimes, because of the degree of looting of everything we value, at what point, now I never am a believer in using the tools of the master. On the other hand, I would really love to hear folks reflect on that, especially in these moments. And I even hate to say this, but I was part of a conversation yesterday in regard to the threat of violence against one of our Supreme Court justices, which is horrifying. But this person was arguing that so much more is at stake than a single person. And of course, I don't want things to disintegrate to the place where we're taking people out that are our enemies, because we all suffer from that. But I'd really love to sort of get to that edge of how far would we go to save the planet? How far would we go to save women's bodily integrity and a right to have control over our own bodies? How far would we go to make, well, you get the point. And so I just love to hear us kick that around, since I know that you all are committed to peace, as am I. But I find in these times, the issues are so life and death and so critical. And it really feels like the pendulum is not swinging our way, despite efforts and commitment. But there's a huge structure of power and money that is that somehow we have to bring down. And what form of resistance will it take to address that machine and the damage it's doing to the most vulnerable, to the planet, etc. But thank you, Michael, for the opportunity to gather us the film. I actually just am so grateful to have viewed it, and good to be with all of you today.
Good to see you, Mary. Thanks. We'll talk soon.
Who wants to tackle that? I mean, I know I want to, but in my role as moderator, I don't feel like it would be appropriate. So I'm going to say, Emma and Michael, do you want to talk a little bit about walking that line and how far we should go and how far we're willing to go?
I can speak a little bit on it, but Will, feel free to say whatever you'd like. I would love to hear your opinions on this. But I think this goes back a little bit to our first question too. And I think a lot of what we're doing is also trying to make narrative change to the general public. And so if the tactic you're using is going to be widely condemned, then who are you bringing into your movement? And that is not true of everything. That's not true of every tactic. I know that the general public was critical of, protesting the Vietnam War and, not always supportive of blockading coal trains. But I think that is a good question when you're thinking about a tactic to ask yourself is like, how am I messaging this to the general public? And who am I going to be able to bring into our movement? Because we can't do it alone. We need more people in our movement. So yeah, that's a little bit about it. But I think like if you're in nonviolent direct action circles, like that is the question of every day. And like that is the question that people spend hours and hours and hours talking to each other about is finding what nonviolent direct action means to you and how to exist and take action in a extremely violent world that we live by. And I know I've spent the past few weeks digging into New Hampshire legislators who are terrible on climate and, found all of them getting money from oil and gas and utilities. And, it is hard to think about that and then continue to do day-to-day climate action work when you know that incredibly unjust thing is happening on the other side.
It does seem that the environmental movement has been very well behaved. I mean, we've had some eco-sabotage here and there going back many years, but on the whole, we've had these lovely nonviolent demonstrations, or there's been some sit downs with people being arrested off railroad tracks and so on, all good. It is kind of surprising given the urgency and the almost certainty that people are going to die in very large numbers if we don't reverse climate change soon, why we haven't had more violence. I think it's probably still a very good thing that we have not. I think we have shown a lot of discipline, or maybe some of us in our hearts still can't quite believe how bad it is. So we're still dealing with this as sort of ordinary politics. I don't know. But I think we've been very well behaved, and it's probably best to stay fairly well behaved, but I do think creative sabotage is maybe next on the agenda. It's creative disruption where you don't hurt any people, but you take the consequences. You don't run from it. And that means a lot of us may have to go to prison for more than like a weekend, but for some real time. I think that's probably on the agenda worldwide. I mean, it is beginning to happen worldwide. I don't know. All this has to be made up specifically each time on a particular target with particular audience, particular goals, and proper preparation. But I think that's where we have to go. And it's not going to be fun. But what's the alternative?
All right. Well, I am going to refrain because I think you guys did an excellent job responding to that, and I don't have anything great to add. But I want to make sure I get back around to Chris's question. So, Chris, go ahead.
Yes, I was very encouraged by the film because it talked about a success. And I hadn't really realized, I guess, how organized the whole draft card burning and collecting and turning in and that part of the draft resistance was. But seeing the film and how it resulted in dismissed sentences, dismissed cases, and reduced sentences and so on, it really indicated that it was successful. It was part of the success of what ended the Vietnam War, which I guess some of the time I think back to the Vietnam War and it's just such a miserable blot on our history that I don't look at the success that ended it. but I'm wondering what kind of well-organized campaigns we could have at this point, both in response to the militarism that's confronting all of us, but also the climate emergency, because I think we really do need a well-organized effort. And I remember my years resisting or finding ways to avoid the draft. I didn't burn a card or I didn't any of that, but I made sure I had jobs that were deferrable, which I guess was part of the goal of the system. I'm just wondering, what do we see that will help us, and what sort of organizing and what particular tactics are we going to, or strategies, what draft card resistance similar thing can we do with the climate emergency, for instance?
Well, that's why we need a lot of thinking from a lot of people. I don't think there's an answer yet. I would add as a footnote, there's another movie being made by some of the same people, which is going to argue that the anti-war movement did stop the war. It particularly stopped it from getting much worse. And that was said in the film you saw. But it's particularly when Nixon, with the moratorium in 1969, Nixon really was planning a major escalation. You saw in the movie that he was thinking of using nukes. Henry Kissinger turns out to be the reasonable man in the room there. But then he looked out his window and saw, 200,000 people marching in Washington and 2 million people marching all across the country. And it wasn't just the usual hippies and communists, it was everybody. So he was stunned. We know this, he's admitted it, but he couldn't make it worse. He was afraid to send any more men over. So it may be that what will happen in the environmental movement is we won't stop global warming. It's already too late to stop it, but we might keep it from being worse. I mean, that has to be the goal, right? We're going to have some of it. We already do have some of it, but we could do a lot to keep it from becoming a lot worse. And maybe that's what it'll be. We didn't stop the war in Vietnam when it should have been stopped in 1965. It took till 1973, basically, when Congress cut off all funds. So maybe that'll be the analogy. We won't have a neat answer. We'll just find out maybe 50 years from now that we prevented certain things from getting a lot worse. That's just off the top of my head.
Emma, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think I'd agree there that I especially say in all of, my speaking and when I'm talking to folks that the climate crisis is happening right now. It's happening already. People are already feeling the impacts of it and are dying from it. And what we're looking at is stopping worse impacts of it, some of the worst impacts of it. So I think it's important to come at it from that perspective. And I think what we need is massive people power, right? Like we need everyone putting all of their ideas into creative tactics and mass direct actions, like again and again and again, making people realize that this is an issue that everyone cares about. And in New Hampshire, a lot of people come from this perspective of, well, we have been great stewards of the land and we have beautiful water and beautiful air. And why do we have to help New York City and LA who have not been good stewards of the land? And that's not true. New Hampshire has just as much of a stake in this, arguably more than a lot of the country and the world. So I think it's definitely having tough conversations and bringing people in.
All right, and we've got more questions coming in, but I'm going to get Betsy Kelly's question here as our last. I do want to be respectful of people's time and reasonably on time. Betsy, can you tell us, your question is, just want to raise up the third act in terms of the climate crisis, but wondering if there's a way to use that kind of tactic on other peace and justice issues. I'm not familiar with third act, so Betsy, would you mind unmuting and telling us just a little bit about what third act is and what those tactics are?
Yes. So this is Bill McKibben's new effort it's focused on baby boomers, those over 60, and based on the power of money, because something like 70 or 75% of the nation's wealth is in the hands, when you talk about individuals, in the hands of those of that age, and that money is power. And so what he has simply come up with is this, and this is brand new, that they have a pledge on the webpage that you can sign, saying that if it's focused on, I believe, 5 big banks, you could probably name them as well as me, Bank of America, Citibank, I'm not sure what the others are, but so the 5 big banks, if you have a credit card with them or any of your money somehow in investments or in those banks, you take a pledge that if they do not stop loaning money to the fossil fuel industry by the end of 2022, that you will take your money out or close out your credit card or whatever you have with one of those or more of those big banks. You're taking your money out from them. And I guess the idea is that it won't come to that, that the movement will be big enough and threatening enough to the big banks who are financing the climate crisis because they keep loaning money to the fossil fuel industry. So that's the theory. And I keep thinking that is so brilliant. How can we do that with war? How can we do that with the immigrants who are being jailed? So I'm just throwing that out there. So I hope everybody will check it out if you're not familiar with it.
Thank you.
I signed the pledge.
Good. Thank you.
Do either of you have a quick response? It is time for us to. Okay.
No, I think it's great. I mean, we may have to stop paying taxes, but that's harder these days since it's all taken off from our salaries.
Well, one of the things that stuck out to me in the film, when I'm looking for lessons to be learned from the film, and I forget who said something like, the selective service won't work without us. We make it work, or some words to those effect.
Yeah.
To that effect. And so I'm thinking that's definitely true with, if the United States is a war machine, if with the climate crisis, we are all part enmeshed in the system that makes it work. So I think Bill's idea is one way of those of us who make it work, getting out of it and not making it work anymore because we're not going to participate. So to me,
one thing
makes
the
a lot of
movie
sense.
did not mention is that the symbol of the resistance, so-called, was a capital letter omega, the last letter of the Greek alphabet. They didn't make much of it, and it's still around. I see it on things. I think we in the East Coast had more to do with getting that circulating. The omega stood for basically ohm, OHM, which is the unit of electrical resistance.
Mm.
So the idea was that we would be, causing trouble in the circuits, in the channels, etc. And I also found out that the opposite of resistance is something called inductance, which was a lot like induction.
Mm-hmm.
Others, however, thought that the omega was a kind of Christian symbol. I am the alpha and the omega, where it was the apocalypse. It was the coming, we're going to stop everything. I sort of enjoyed that thought, but it seemed to me too apocalyptic, frankly. That's not how social change takes place or should take place. It has to be more steady, incremental, and so on. So I thought the resistance idea was best. So let your body be a friction in the machine.
Yeah, like gumming up the wheels, the gears.
Yes, exactly.
All right. Well, we are a few minutes over time now.
Okay.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Emma, so much for your time. I do want to, before I give you a few upcoming events, I want to highlight that Monday, July 18th, we're going to be having a peace and justice conversation on Erica Chenoweth's work. The details are in the chat. I won't be here for that, but this conversation about how we use nonviolence to change the course that our system is on will continue then. We've got a few events between now and then to pay attention to. I'll be presenting next Tuesday before leaving on a 3-month sabbatical, and I'm just going to do an overview of what's going on in the foreign policy and militarism world, and then Amy Antonucci, who's on the call the call tonight, is going to be taking over as host of the series. June 20th, she'll be hosting Dr. Leo Sandy, who's going to talk about how the media and our school systems and our government sell war to people. Then after the Chenoweth talk on August 1st, Jamal Abdi is going to talk to us about Iran and the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which seems like it may be dead in the water, but hopefully Jamal can give us some steps forward. So thank you all for being with us tonight. I will turn off the live stream and keep it open so that if you people want to hang out and chat a little more, you can.